Sure. Hi, my name is Cadwallader. I'm born and raised in New Hampshire. I went to Phillips Exeter for 2 years. I'm now the creative director of Mugler Fashion in Paris. I studied architecture before I went into fashion, and I'm very excited to have this conversation today.
You want to just pick someone to pass it off to?
Sure, I'll pass it off to Kevin.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And my name's Kevin Jennings. I'm the CEO of Lambda Legal. We're America's oldest and largest LGBT rights legal advocacy organization, otherwise known as the people who brought you marriage equality. You're welcome. And before coming to Lambda Legal, I spent my career in the field of education. I began as a high school history teacher 35 years ago and worked my way up to being Assistant Secretary of Education for President Obama. I don't know who to pass it off to. Mercy.
Hi, you all. I just want to say thank you for having me and also for creating this organization. I'm inspired by the project and by all of the youth that I work with, and many of whom are here, which is wonderful. My name is Mercy Carbonell. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am an English teacher at Phillips Exeter Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire. I have been teaching English here since 1993 and coaching some sports and working with students in terms of social justice and youth activism, particularly around the arts. And I, perhaps for this panel, something that's important to know is that my late partner and colleague, Christine Robinson, and I were the first faculty to come out in an all-school assembly in, I think, 1994. Kevin had just spoken, I think, a week before. And the story of that coming out is pretty much a testament to the struggle of queering a space in a predominantly and historically white, cis, hetero, patriarchal institution. So more on that later, but I'm glad to be here and thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm AL. I use they, them pronouns. I currently live in Edison, New Jersey, where I'm a community organizer. And I'm also a PhD candidate at Columbia University, where I study youth activism and basically how adults and youth build intergenerational solidarity together. So I'm also really excited to be here today and can't wait to have a conversation with you all.
Awesome, thank you all. So Sarah, passing it off to you, take it away.
Thank you everyone for introducing yourself. I'm excited to talk to you all today. So the first thing I want to start off is, well, where was the first place that you felt out of the mainstream due to your identity? And because of that, like, what was your first introduction to a queer space?
Do you want me to take that one?
Please feel free to popcorn among yourselves.
Okay, cool. I mean, I thought a lot about that question because I don't think that I actually entered a queer space until I went, I mean, maybe small bubbles of queer spaces, but I grew up in rural New Hampshire and I actually didn't have any gay role models at all when I was growing up. I only found myself actually meeting other gay people for the first time when I was at Phillips Exeter. I went to public school for 2 years and then I went to Exeter for 2. At Exeter, I happened to fall in love with someone that was my gender for the first time and was able to explore that and what it meant to me. But it all was there wasn't really an open space for that. It was a very private space in which that occurred. He actually presented as straight and had a girlfriend, and it was very complicated at the time. I didn't really find a bigger queer community until I went to university. So I don't know. I think I'm the age. I'm 41, and so I grew up in a time and place where queer culture wasn't as public. It was something that you had to run to the city for. It was something that you had to I don't know, go to university for or really seek out. And where I grew up, it wasn't very easy. So for me, I think the first time I ever entered a bigger queer space was at Cornell University, where I met a very strong lesbian who became one of my best friends and who really tried to bring people together and tried to, you know, have dinners and have parties for people who were queer. And that was the first time that I even understood that there's such variety to being queer. I thought that I was gay and everyone else that was gay was like me. And only then did I start to realize all of the diversity and beauty that's in our community. But that's how starving I was for it at that point. I, I, I felt very alone up until that point.
So I think another thing.
Okay. No, I'm happy to go too. And maybe it's I'm about 10 years older than Casey, so I'm 51. And I would also say that I played a lot of sports. I played Little League. I was the only girl. I was very conscious of being the only girl. And so I think I became a feminist and a queer feminist very early. And although those words were not accessible, and if anything, they were considered probably derogatory at the time. But I think I also felt, I felt out of the mainstream in the sense that I really identified as an artist early on too, and felt that that was not what was sort of where I grew up in Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. There was much more of an emphasis on being a lawyer or a doctor or somebody who made lots of money. And I was much more interested in either playing in dirt and climbing trees and creating bike ramps or making art. And so I felt out of sync with people in that way. But I wanted to tell a story that my grandfather, my father and my grandfather are architects, and my grandfather was originally from Cuba and used to travel a lot. And he got to be friends with a man named Klaus who was an architect in Berlin. And he came to our Thanksgiving dinners every year and wore these fabulous suits and smoked like beautifully long cigarettes. And he and I hung out all the time. So in a space where I often didn't feel welcome, Thanksgiving is always, I think, problematic for lots of reasons. There was Klaus, and then suddenly he died, and he was gone, and no one talked about it. And he was actually, I think, in hindsight, the first person that I knew who died of AIDS. And I wish I could have spoken with him about being queer.
So on that same note, why do you think that representation is so important, especially in mainstream spaces?
I mean, for me, it's very interesting because when I was young, there was representation in film, but there wasn't representation so much in sitcoms or even on MTV, or it was really still something that was quiet. And I think that without representation, the dialogue stops at the end of the space. And I think now that there is media that penetrates people that don't really have firsthand experience of queer people, there's at least that moment of reflection that they can have about what it means to be queer and what the difficulties might be, what the beauties might be. Whereas for me, when I grew up, there was nothing. I had one gay uncle, and he was an alcoholic, and my family really didn't like him. And so for us, to be gay kind of meant to be flawed, and it meant, that's because that's all we had as an example. It meant you should hide it. It meant that you were hurt, that you weren't as good as everyone else. And that's the environment that I grew up in, now we get to see many different colors of what it means to be gay, in positive light, in negative light, in all the different variety that queer life comes in. So I think it just allows ourselves to build a little bit of space in our brain for what that means, even if you are straight and not at all in the culture.
Well, as I mentioned, I worked in the Obama administration, and Michelle Obama has a great phrase: if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think that's why representation matters. I'm 57, and I was born in 1963, and I think it's probably virtually impossible for the young people on this call to imagine how very different the world was in 1963. In 1963, same-sex relationships were still a crime in 49 states. Interracial marriage was illegal in 17 states. Being gay was a mental illness which could get you put against your will in a mental hospital where you could be subjected to electroshock therapy, or if you were a man, castrated against your wishes. The world in which I grew up was dramatically different than today's world. I'm very proud that Lambda Legal in 2003 actually got the remaining so-called sodomy laws, which were the laws that criminalize same-sex behaviors, same-sex relationships, struck down in the Supreme Court. And let's all have a moment of silence for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And let's hope that the court does not become an enemy of equality with her passing. So when I was growing up, there were kind of two LGBT role models on television. And maybe Mercy will remember, but none of the rest of you are, but I urge you to Google these people. There was Paul Lynde on the Hollywood Squares, and there was Miss Jane Hathaway on the Beverly Hillbillies. And they were kind of the gay and the lesbian role models, and there were no trans people or pansexual or anything at all of that nature. And it just made it impossible to visualize a happy future for yourself. And in 1988, when I came out to my students, when I was teaching at Concord Academy, and we created the first gay-straight alliance in the world, it was kind of by accident. It was largely because we were just pissed that there was nothing out there. And I think there's a lesson in that, you know, Al, I'm really fascinated by your thesis research. Mm-hmm. And I think that if there's any lesson from my generation's experience in my life that I would offer to young people today, don't wait for leaders. Be the leader. Just go be the leader. Because leaders generally tend to follow, has been my experience. Every now and then you'll have somebody extraordinary like Barack Obama come along who genuinely leads, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or John Lewis. But most so-called leaders don't really lead very much. They tend to wait until they get the signal that it's safe, and then they lead. And it takes everyday people making a stand. And I don't know if any of you have GSAs in your schools or went to schools with GSAs, but I'll tell you the story of how the first GSA got created. The day after I came out at Concord Academy, a young girl stormed into my office. And I was like, hello, because she wasn't my student. She was a freshman. It was only about 7 weeks into the school year, so I didn't really know her. In fact, the main way I knew her was she was the hot freshman girl who had the hot senior boyfriend who was always making out outside my classroom, which frankly annoyed the shit out of me. And I was like, can I help you? And she goes, yeah, I want to start a club to fight homophobia. And I was like, okay. Because I was surprised because I thought any student who'd want to do this would have to be LGBT. And the evidence was pretty strong she was not LGBT. At least from what I'd seen. And so I was curious. I said, so tell me why you care so much about this. And she said, oh, that's easy. My mother's a lesbian and I'm tired of hearing my family get put down around this school. naive little 24-year-old me had never thought about the fact that I might have a student who had an LGBT parent. You have to remember in the 1980s, it was not nearly as common for LGBT people to have children as it is now. And I said, okay, but well, what do you want to call this club? And on the spot, she said, I don't know. You're gay and I'm straight. Let's call it the Gay Straight Alliance. And that is literally where the name came from.
Great.
And it all started because a 15-year-old freshman at Concord Academy said, I've had enough. So when you feel like you've had enough of something, just stand up and say enough. And you might be surprised how the world changes.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Bravo to her.
yeah, totally. So I'm 29, so I'm like almost 10 years younger than Casey, or I'm a little bit more than that. But I was thinking about this question of like, when were you feeling out of mainstream? And honestly, like in my experience growing up, it wasn't like any specific moment that I could pinpoint, but more like a constellation of moments where you felt like just not normal or not fitting in, and like the being included into a queer space. I think the first time I looked around and I was like, wow, everyone around me is a queer person, and everyone around me like is here to like care for me and affirm me. Wasn't until like probably 3 or 4 years ago when I became a Point Foundation scholar, and we had a national convening of all the Point Foundation scholars. So Point Foundation is a scholarship that provides tuition and basically all the needs you need for going into college as well as for grad school. So I encourage all the young people on this call, if you're looking for a way to kind of support yourself and your education as you're going into college or into graduate school, to look into it. But it was the first time I was ever in a room and I was like, 100% of the people here are LGBTQ and some like identified, and like we are all here like literally just celebrating each other, and like it, like all of these like nitty gritty questions of like you know, like sometimes people ask you like, what are you studying or where do you go to school, and it feels like very straight, I guess, like they're trying to like suss you out and like see who you are, but it really felt like truly a celebration that wasn't even until a couple of years ago. And so as you all are talking, especially Kevin, when you're saying, yeah, like the young people are leading, I'm thinking now of like ways I feel represented, or ways that I feel like that, like I'm proud of, or like I see myself reflected in the community, is really where spaces where young people are leading. Like I do not feel more affirmed than when I'm on like queer leftist TikTok, and like it's all literally high schoolers creating content that was like truly affirming, and like I'm like, dang, that was me. Like that's what I wish I had at that age, to feel like, wow, like there are people who get me, who share my language, who share my goals in life, and like I'm seen even though I'm in a community where I might be the only queer person I know. So I think like young people are creating these spaces, and are the people I look up to like consistently now, not only for representation, but for like imagining what a new and more radical and more queer future looks like.
The secret that nobody tells you in American history class is that young people have always been the ones who created change in this country. Alexander Hamilton was something like 19 years old when the revolution started. Martin Luther King was 25 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. John Lewis was something like 20 when he led the first sit-ins in Nashville that led to desegregation of lunch counters in that city. When we started the first Gay Straight Alliance, Meredith was 15, I was 24. It's always been young people who take the lead in creating change in this country. And I don't in any way mean to sound ageist, because I think people my age have a role to play. But I think that young people play a unique role for two reasons. First of all, the idealism of youth is a uniquely powerful force. I think something happens to a lot of people when they get older, when they start thinking, well, you know, this is the way the world is and you have to put up with it. A lot of young people haven't accepted that yet, and good for you. And number two, young people have less to lose. in some ways. They don't have mortgages or children to worry about or car payments to make yet, and all that shit that weighs you down when you're older.
Yeah.
And so a lot of young people are willing to take risks that a lot of older people are too scared to take. So I think young people have some unique advantages in being change makers that you should take advantage of and use them, because you have some built-in advantages that older people lack.
I 100% agree with everything that you've been saying. I think what you highlighted, like, it's so important for, I think, young people and just normal people to have these conversations within themselves, because that just like contributes to normalization and just, you know, I think really defining how we'll move forward with our identities, and I think really accepting them. And I think that everyone here, honestly, like through the work they do, that you're all role models, and everything you say is incredibly informative and educational for the young people in order for them to rise up and kind of contribute their voices. So on that note, like, how do you feel that you've created a space within your industry for other queer individuals?
I mean, I can speak to that because I'm in the smallest world. And I would say that, and I need to just give a shout out to one of my former colleagues who is on this call, Lauren O'Neill, who has left Phillips Exeter but is a co-conspirator in this work. In a place like Phillips Exeter Academy, and many of you may be in colleges or in high schools, representation is really, really low. There are only probably, I can only think of 10, maybe not even 10 out colleagues that I have in the entire school. There has, in the history, in my 28 years here, there's only been one or two BIPOC queer faculty. They were both interns. They left after a year or two. And there is one trans colleague that I have who was actually part of one of the reasons that I even came out on that stage in 1994 in the first place. But so a lot of the ways in which I have found that I like queer the space is simply by being here and by staying, which is not always easy. And also by making my classroom, which is where I am right now, a place where when queer students come in, they will recognize themselves, and they will see themselves in the art, and they will see themselves in the writers and the posters and the quotations on the blackboard. And I think also that I do sometimes have to constantly be that person who reminds some of my cis-straight, or many of my cis-straight colleagues, to think about the ways in which they are opening up space for queer youth and queer students. And ultimately just to sort of celebrate in what Kevin, you were naming, which is that, and AL, you were naming this too, just that the youth that I mean, we're here right now because of youth that I was fortunate enough to work with at Phillips Exeter. And I think that just continuing to celebrate and advocate for and promote my students' work is really, really, really important. And it's, you know, it's slow going in a place like this, but there's just a new development that we've been working on, a few people. It's to create sort of a queer alumni trust where people can come together and talk and particularly celebrate the arts. So in this small world, I think I just have to keep doing it, keep naming it, I have to come out all the time. I come out like 2 or 3 times a day and just keep coming out. And, you know, someone said like, oh, some student said to me the other day, like, if I come out, like, is it hard? And I said, well, yeah, but you're going to do it forever, depending on where you are. So you might as well get going. No, I don't promote necessarily coming out until you're ready. But that's something else that I'm really conscious of. In a really, really, in a place like this, you have to keep coming out.
That's very beautiful. So I think, yeah, 3 years ago, I found myself for the first time being the boss of a fashion house, which was something I've been in fashion for about 20 years, worked on many fashion shows. I would say 90% of which have been 6 foot tall, 17-year-old, not 7-year-old, 17-year-olds. That would be really bad. 17-year-old, blonde, you know, stick figure women. And that's just the way it was for a very long time. And I never liked it. And I always worked in fashion, but then I became the creative director of a house where, yes, one part of my responsibility is to make the clothes and to make the proportions and the textures and the colors. And then the other thing that I became aware of maybe about 5 years before is who you choose to represent your brand with, who you choose to decide to say to the world that you think are beautiful. And I think I knew it was coming, but I must say I immediately made some pretty bold decisions about who I would decide to represent Mugler and my vision of what beauty is. And I work in Paris. I think America has made a lot of really great strides with diversity on the runway, both in terms of age and size and shape and also identity. But really, I must say, in Paris, it's very, very strict still. Most fashion shows are very, very tall, very, very thin women. And I think sometimes they'll use people of color, but it's a predominantly very, very white situation. So from the very beginning, I've been casting women in their 50s, 60s, even in their 70s, women of different shapes and sizes. But it doesn't stop there. I'm a women's wear designer, but I put men on the runway. I put trans men and trans women on the runway. And it's really about showing the world what the beauty, all the beauty that can be found everywhere. And I think it's very funny. I mean, my whole life, when you have a model casting, models come in, they put on something skimpy and they walk up and down the room and then they leave and you decide, she's great, she's not great. And I started a new thing where I said, I'm not doing that. It's horrible for the person. I don't get to meet them. I don't know if I believe in this person just based on that sort of weird engagement. So I became the first person to have every model come and sit down and talk to me and say, hey, what do you do? What are you working on? Where are you from? How are things? And actually also starting to cast people who weren't just models, but who were activists, who were poets, who were filmmakers, who were artists. Because actually what matters is the beauty of what resonates from inside of you. Mm-hmm. And if you do the work and you decide to cast 30 people who each believe in themselves, have been through struggles, when the lights turn on and you put them in the clothes and they walk down the runway, you can see in their eyes something that is so much more empowering than just flat beauty. And at the same time, you change the world because you're showing people, beautiful people on the runway who might look like them, who might be curvy, who might be trans, who might be a man in women's shoes, all of the different things. And I don't know, I'm just happy to have that platform now because there are many people that are doing that. And in the end, people are really excited about it. And they're really feeling like there's a new openness to fashion that wasn't really there before.
Casey, what you said about like sitting down with someone and asking them like who they are and how they are and like how they're showing up to the space and how they're feeling, I think is also really resonates with me in terms of like how to queer up like academic spaces or teaching spaces. Because I think like we think a lot about like almost like emotion and cognition as being so dichotomous, like they're two separate things. And when you show up as a student or you show up as a scholar, you're thinking intellectually, which means it's rigorous, which means it's intellectual and like cognitive thinking only. When there really isn't such a clear cut, like I think so much of it should be like acknowledging and centering how people are feeling and how they're showing up to the space, whether the space is joyful, whether they feel like they can be joyful in that space, and that there isn't like, it's not like to sever the feeling from the thinking is so much of like how I think queering things up can happen in academia as well. To think of like, you know, knowledge and ignorance is not a binary, just like just like thinking and feeling aren't either. Oftentimes I think in my experience, so I had the opportunity to work on a Stonewall curriculum for the National Park Service last year with my advisor, Sandra Schmidt at Teachers College. And we were talking a lot about how like just LGBTQ history is so additive in so many academic spaces, whether it be K-12 or in higher education. But just thinking of how to like hold open this space where we are thinking just like what the history was, but like how normal as an idea was constructed, and how like mutuality and consent can happen in a classroom, and like all of those things are part of I think like queering up or like queering the space of learning, alongside like all the facts and the people that we look up to and the historical events that have happened. So I think like, yes, it is so important to acknowledge and affirm like how people are showing up to the space and who they are and how they're feeling, well, aside from what they're doing and accomplishing.
For sure, that's true.
Yeah, Al, I love that. Oh, go ahead, Kevin. You haven't gone.
Oh, yeah, I think for me, so I think because of my age, a lot of the time I was the first in a lot of ways. And that was an interesting experience. And there were, I want to be clear with people, it wasn't always fun. You know, it wasn't always fun. And I want to give you a little trigger warning. I'm going to show you, when I was appointed Assistant Secretary of Education 11 years ago, I was subjected to a really brutal assault by the right wing because I was the highest openly LGBT person ever in the U.S. Department of Education. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Oh, you have to enable me to do this, I think.
Yep, give me just a second. I should be able to.
Yeah, because I want to show you a sample headline that greeted me. And I think that...
Okay, go ahead, Kevin. Try it again.
Okay, here we go. This is not fun to look at, so you might want to look away if you have a weak stomach. This was the one of the blogs that greeted me.
Jesus.
Wow.
This was kind of stuff that I was greeted with pretty regularly during my 2 years in the Obama administration. So I'll stop. Now I don't know how to stop sharing my screen.
Just press stop share at the top.
Oh, okay, great. There, I don't want to subject you to that for too long. There is a funny story around that. My father was a Baptist evangelist. So I called my family and I said, who knew we were Jewish? You know, they were so hateful that they even got my religion wrong. But there are just, if you're really going to blaze new ground, you better have a pretty thick skin, is one of my pieces of advice for you. But I want to share with you a story that I think is really, really important for you to know. If you follow what's going on politically, you know that in June, the Supreme Court ruled that LGBT people can no longer be fired from their jobs because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Two things I want you to know about that. Lambda Legal brought the first case arguing that the Civil Rights Act prohibited people from being fired based on their sexual orientation, their gender identity, 14 years ago. It took 14 years of fighting to get that victory. So lesson one is keep in mind that change sometimes takes a long time. Lesson two is one of the plaintiffs in that suit was a woman named Amy Stevens. Amy Stevens was a trans woman from Michigan. She worked in a funeral home. She informed her employer that she was planning to come out as trans, and they fired her. And she decided to fight back. And she sued. And October 8th, 2019, she finally had her day in court. There were oral arguments in the Supreme Court. And this was the first ever case heard in front of the Supreme Court on the rights of trans people in American history. It was all because Amy Stevens stood up and said, no, I'm not going to let you treat me like this. And as you know, there's a happy ending to the story, which is on June 15th, the Supreme Court ruled in Amy's favor and said you can no longer fire people in this country because of their gender identity. But there's a sad twist to the story you may not know. Amy didn't live to see that day. Amy died in May. Now, the fact that there are queer spaces at all for us to enjoy today is because there were people like Amy Stevens who stood up to the oppression our forebears faced and said, no. And they created the spaces that we have today. And so I want to offer a challenge, particularly to the young people on this call. You owe the Amy Stevens of the world a debt. And the way you repay that debt is you make sure the next generation has it better than you have it. Just like Amy made sure that your generation had it better than her generation had it. You know, like Moses, who led the Jews out of captivity but never got to live in the promised land, Amy led trans people to the day in which they could no longer be fired because of their gender identity, but Amy never lived to see that day. You did. You will benefit from Amy's sacrifice. Go out and make it better for the next generation of trans people, and the next generation of LGBT people, and the next generation of pansexual people. Do it for Amy.
Kevin, thank you. You're reminding me of Harvey Milk and the work that he did. And I've been thinking also a little bit about how important it is for youth to be queering political spaces. And I think we're starting to see that more and more. And if, for those of you who don't know who Harvey Milk was, he was the first openly gay member of, in San Francisco, was assassinated along with George Moscone. And the documentary called The Times of Harvey Milk, which was produced by Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman, is worth seeing if you haven't seen it. But it's another example, I think, of, and I think as hard as they are, those stories, they're so important to hold on to and to remember and to know and to keep showing. I think that's another, I've been thinking a little bit about like the way in which we teach literature and what stories we tell each other. You know, we're not going to forget the story that Kevin just told us and the way that you told it. And so I think we also have a responsibility to keep telling our stories and to keep writing them and to bringing them out to for publication. Even if you don't think your writing is any good, chances are it is. And also I just want to return back and kind of bring us back to Al, what you were talking about in terms of the ways in which you know, sort of like white supremacy has so segregated our consciousness. And I think we have an opportunity right now also to kind of draw together and like to queer our consciousness with thinking that our emotional lives and being vulnerable are absolutely central to all of this work. I got up this morning, I slept last night on the couch because I was like listening to testimonies and reflections about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and fell sound asleep at 2 and then woke up at 5 and was like, oh shit, I think I need to rally. And I got on my bike and I was listening to this new NPR thought line on James Baldwin and the ways in which he could hold both rage and love. And so I think we also have an opportunity to kind of hold rage and love together and bring that out constantly and let those things be together instead of being opposites. So Kevin, thank you for that.
I love what you just said.
what you both just said reminds me of this lyric from Blue Scholars. I listen to them a lot. In their song about Yuri Kochiyama, they say, revolutionaries die, but the revolution don't. And that reminds me of Amy Stevens, and it also reminds me of what you're all saying, like, that we're all here, here and then like also out in the world, trying to make the future more queer and more radical and more hopeful and more loving and accepting for folks like us. And like, while we're doing that, like, it is a lot of work, but we also, like, in being true to being queer, like, let's make sure we also like take care of each other and make sure it's joyful, and the revolution is full of singing and dancing and like celebrating each other as well. Like, one way that this like white supremacist like thinking and dichotomy has like seeped into my life recently, being a community organizer, has been like, I just feel so guilty if I need to take a break and I want to rest. And I think like there's so much more work to be done. I can't take a break. And like, if we try to like replicate this productivity work ethic in our organizing, then we're just like replicating that sort of like capitalist white supremacist culture of like grinding until you can't take it anymore and you get burnt out. So like, it's so important for us to remember, as we're queering spaces, to center our love and joy, not only for ourselves, but for each other, so that we can keep sustaining this work, and like be prepared for like the 14-year marathons. And like, don't think of this as a sprint. Think of it as a way that we can collectively take care of each other towards that end.
There's oh my God, we're both going for Audre Lorde. You go, Mercy.
It fell off the wall this morning, which actually makes me concerned, but that's a different issue. We'll put it back up. I just would love to read it just to celebrate what you said, Al. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that's an act of political warfare. Kevin, go ahead.
You win, ditto.
That is insanely powerful, what I just heard. And on that same note, like kind of tying into what we were talking about earlier, I know that you guys are talking about how to improve the conversation around queering spaces, but in terms of queer youth that are in high school and college and haven't necessarily entered the job force yet, how would you say that we could improve the conversation around queering spaces, just where we are right now in life?
Eleanor Roosevelt, who pretty much wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was asked, where do human rights begin? And she said, human rights begin in small places close to home. And we often think that human rights are at places like the UN or the Capitol or the governor's mansion or the state house or whatever. No, human rights begin in small places close to home. Your classroom, your block, your house of worship if you go to one. Start where you are and make a stand where you are. Like, I never intended, and neither did Meredith, to create a nationwide movement when we started the GSA at Concord Academy in 1988. We were just sick of hearing homophobic language around the school. But today, over half of American high schools have GSAs. Take a stand where you are. You never know where it might lead. So, and like I said earlier, stop waiting for leaders. Be the leader. President Obama used to always quote a great feminist singing group called Sweet Honey in the Rock, who has a song which is, "We are the ones we have been waiting for." We are the ones we have been waiting for. Remember that.
I also think you're doing it. I think this panel is an example. I know Justin Lee is here, and he was the founder, and so many other, I see some names that I recognize as students. And Sarah, you're at Exeter High School. I think you're doing it. I really do. And so I just want to echo what Kevin is saying. And I think also, Casey, your story is a good example of how no matter what space you find yourself in, there is queering to be done.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
And you know, it's endless work. I think there was a question in the question sent to us that had to do with the difference between queering a space and creating an inclusion, like an inclusive space, which I think is a really beautiful question, actually, and reminds me a lot of we're doing a lot of work on anti-racism at Phillips Exeter right now. And I think that's a similar question that we're asking, you know, like I don't think it's enough to be inclusive anymore. I mean, inclusion is beautiful and lovely and that's great. But I think there are also, I think queering also, and I think Kevin, your work is like, you know, sort of the most historical example that we have in this space right now of how other things, like in the process of, we often think that like you have to dismantle something in order to like envision anew. I actually think those actions take place simultaneously, and that they have to be constantly taking space simultaneously. And so I think there are absolutely, I mean, I tend to be a system thinker and a structural thinker. So I think there are structural and systemic problems that need addressing. And I also think there are ways to be playful and ways to be provocative and racy and like sexy inside of taking on some of these, doing some of this queerness. And that all of that has to be, like we all have to find ways to do it. And to do it with others is the other thing I just wanted to say. If the thing I have probably sacrificed the most, and Lauren O'Neill, who's on this call, has heard me say this before, but is that it's lonely. It's really lonely at times. And particularly if you find yourself in a space that is predominantly cis straight. So, you know, like make sure that part of self-care is also making sure that you seek out people who can work with you and that you have opportunities like this. This is like the closest to some kind of like beautiful thing I've had in a while. So I think you're creating it, and you're creating it for me. And I'm like an old lady at this point. So thank you. The yawn kitty is not making me feel very good. I just want to say, like the yawn kitty is bored. That's one way of queering a space too.
Harbs, do you want to show your classroom? That might.
Sure, and you might get dizzy, although Casey's been moving around a little bit too, because he's on the water.
It just started raining, so I had to run under a roof.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd like to do actually is just also give a nod at this point to Justin Lee, who's here. Hi, and I have a postcard of his work from last year. It's an very fab. I think also this is work that that Elizabeth did, which is to bring Angels in America, a production of Angels in America, into the church. That's amazing. The poster. Also, shout out to Lauren O'Neill, who put together this Queer Kids exhibit with the photographer Michael Sharkey. But so here's my classroom. There's a fine line between hoarding and queering.
I miss
Looks
your
pretty good
so much.
Also,
my name is written on your ceiling somewhere, I think.
Did you do that?
I did not do that.
So bad.
And that actually leads me to say something else. I mean, I am a hoarder, and I like stuff. So, but if you ever find yourself in a space, I also think I think that when students start to advocate for what they want to see in their classroom spaces or in their home spaces, that goes a long way too. So I think you have a voice there too, to say, wait, I'd like to see some other images in here.
yeah, just want to open it up again that if people have questions, they should feel free to ask them. They can ask anyone or directly ask a panelist.
I have a question I want to ask, but I just wanted to introduce myself first. My name is Mac Enrolla. I'm a sophomore at Columbia right now, and I use he, him, his. And it's good to see all of you, and thank you so much for hosting this panel and this discussion that we've been having. And one of my questions that I wanted to ask is, in regards to the digital age and the rise of social media, especially in 2020, I think in recent years we've seen a heavy increase in like social media usage, and especially as, you know, during a pandemic, we rely heavily on the internet and social media to connect. And I was wondering about where you see the future of queering spaces, and especially finding other queer allies and queer peers, I guess, to where do you see the future of that experience going, as far as, you know, being so spread right now and with the internet and social media in general?
I guess I'll jump in on this one. I mean, I think the power of social media is the good part, which is the part that brings us together and that allows us to see each other no matter what's happening. And I think more and more, you know, in the beginning, maybe we thought that social media was light, and that it was about lightly showing each other what we were doing or lightly connecting. And I think now we realize that it has a huge political influence, it has a huge social influence, and how important it is to be really represented in that space. And it's obviously such a great space to be represented in. So I don't know, for me and for my work, it's all about that right now. It's all about how to make the community that's interested in our work know that we are interested in them, and that and to create that dialogue and to make it really authentic. Because I think that's the thing about social media, it often isn't authentic, it often is very false. And how to actually make sure that voices are heard and news stories are heard, and that it becomes human as much as possible, especially when we're all locked in our houses. So yeah, I think it's one of the most important frontiers we've got.
Yeah, I think that you raise a really important danger of social media, Casey. First of all, the thing that has changed the most for queer young people in the world has been the advent of the internet. You know, when I started GLSEN, we literally typed letters, put them in envelopes, and mailed them to people. That must seem like I'm describing use of hieroglyphs to you. But that's what we had to do. And organizing was a hell of a lot harder. And the advent of, you know, it makes connection in so many ways so much easier. But I was writing with a friend last night about why I don't like Instagram, because has anybody ever had a bad day on Instagram? You know, not from my feed. Everybody's life is fabulous. And there's a real problem with authenticity. You know, people take like 1,000 pictures to get that one perfect picture to put on Instagram. You know, and so I think the more you can challenge social media spaces to be places where, as Casey put it, people are being genuinely authentic, the better, because they are creating a whole new dynamic of inauthenticity, I think, for a lot of people, and are places where people are being either covertly or overtly bullied. That is a whole nother problem. You know, I was bullied relentlessly in school as a young queer person, but at least by the time I got home at 3:30, I was safe. You're not safe anymore.
That's for sure.
And
I was going to say, I think most people are having a good day on Instagram, or they're having a really bad day. Because there is a lot of bullying and there's a lot of attacking that goes on as well. Yes, people are trying to project their perfect life, but at the same time, it's a place of a lot of conflict as well.
I want to say, like, the other thing about social media that's been really great during this time has been just the ability for people, like, across geographies to organize together, to use social media as a tool for activism and social change. I think, like, social media has been important before the pandemic for exactly that reason. I think a lot rurally, organizing rurally in the suburbs, like, social media is such an important tool. But I think particularly for, like, youth discourses, like, y'all are using, like, social media to create new discourses that aren't beholden to the dominant political narrative, right? Like, on TikTok, this is happening. On Instagram, this is happening. And, like, I think, like, there's a space for, like, using social media as a tool for, like, actually youth-led and youth-centered political narratives that is unlike in other spaces. Like, so yeah, like, I think that's really important as well. And I see that happening all the time, which is really exciting.
I have a question if I could jump in. My name is Sivas Immonen. I'm actually one of Justin's advisors at Brown and RISD. I'm studying fashion design and international relations, so I look up to Casey and Kevin, like, you guys are amazing. I wanted to ask, because I think being in spaces like Brown and RISD, where the community is very progressive generally, I think that sometimes the queer community engagement sort of meets the need. So, like, how do you, because, so, like, the group here doesn't feel very strong. So how do you build a space and, like, celebration and power and stuff when sometimes it feels like it doesn't need to be there?
I just wanted to say that I went to Brown in the 80s, and it was like, that was actually, there was so much queerness happening. And I'm sad to hear that it's not as dominant. I just need to say that. So it was a different time though. I mean, we obviously needed it desperately, and it was underground a little bit too. So maybe that's another difference.
It feels very open, but I just feel like we could be doing more outward things. Like, I think we do a lot for each other, but sometimes I'm like, there's a lot of activism that I think we need to tap into.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking of that I've been thinking a lot about actually, and I'm getting more involved. I think when you're inside elite spaces, it's really important to get outside of them. And how do we get outside of them? But there are so many high schools for instance, in Providence. And there's such a diverse community, like so many different kinds of communities, ethnically and racially and socioeconomically in Providence, that I could imagine that there are students in high schools who don't feel like they can connect or can speak out. And so maybe there's a way to, get that out there somehow, especially using social media. But I think it's a pretty, and just because you have so much access to the arts, you could do it through the arts also. But that would be one of the things that I would recommend, is to just try to reach out to some of the local high schools and start there. And, sort of as Kevin said, sometimes it will grow from there.
The other thing I would offer is that it's still illegal to be gay in 70 countries around the globe. And in a dozen of them, you can still be put to death. So I would urge people to get involved with groups like All Out, if you know that group, or Voices For, which are groups that do work. And All Out does work you can do from your computer. Voices For is more, maybe you could start a chapter in Providence. They are more a civil disobedience direct action organization. The fact of the matter is that we need to be taking a stand for people who are being silenced in other countries. We have the privilege of being able to be relatively free and being able to speak out. And I think with that privilege comes a responsibility to use the privilege. You can do one of two things with your privilege. You can benefit it from it unfairly, or you can use it to help people who don't have it. That's your moral choice.
Well said. An important choice.
I've got a question if I could. So my name's Ben. I'm a freshman at Columbia, and I had like a similar upbringing to Casey, where growing up in like rural New Hampshire, like not really like any type of like queer role model or anything like that, not really being like exposed to any sort of strong queer community until my junior year of high school. So I was just wondering, like, how do you guys feel is the best way to like break away from this sort of like comfort or complacency that can be found in like straight spaces, just from like lack of exposure to like a strong queer influence?
There's a great nonprofit started by a young person who just graduated from Yale called Hope in a Box. And what they do is they literally send kits of queer affirming literature to teachers who agree to teach them in rural schools, complete with a curriculum guide so the teacher knows what to do. And I would urge you to find some other queer alums of your school. It costs $300 to adopt a school. Raise the $300 and have a kit sent to your favorite teacher at your old school. And get them to start queering the space of their high school English class. You know, and this, once again, the young man who started at Joe English graduated from Yale 2 years ago. And he, like you, went to a small rural high school in upstate New York where there was nothing. And he didn't forget what that experience was like. And he's now created a nonprofit to try to queer the spaces of rural high schools. So that's another great example of how your generation is stepping up and making a difference. So I just offer that, you know, as a great example. You can find it on the web at hopeinabox.org. That's a great thing to get involved with also. You know, and if you feel, once again, like Joe did, that there's a need and nobody's doing anything about it, just create it yourself. Don't wait for somebody else, just create it yourself.
Ben, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so I live in my hometown right now, which is like, you know, a suburb of New York, and it's also very much complacent. I think like there's not very much queer visibility, and this is where I grew up. And a group of like basically queer folks that I just met like since moving back, and I have just been doing like random acts of, I don't want to say deviance, but maybe mischief to like raise visibility. So we raised a pride flag in a random park, and like it was only there for about 2 weeks before it was taken down. But I think like just like kind of disrupting the physical spaces that are like just accepted as feeling like just the way they are. Like it's easy. It just like it cost us like $10 to put up the flag. We went together and did it, and like I think there are small things that you can think or ask people who still live in your community, like what would that disruption be, or like what do you wish the disruption you saw was, and just go do it. Like you could just easily do it yourself or with a friend. In our group that where we organize, we say like we have a rule of threes, which is like as long as 3 people are somewhere, that's an action. Like you don't need a lot of people. You don't need 10, 20, 30 people. Just 3 people can make a big difference and disrupt like the everyday kind of complacency that people have all the time.
It's all about sanding down the edges. It's about getting something that punches through your bubble and makes other people see you, and also shows them what amazing energy and beauty and intelligence there is in the community. And I think that's something that, you know, queer people have done so well for so long. And I think it's still one of the strongest voices because our voice is positive and intelligent and embracing. And I think the more that we can push that, the better we'll all be.
I think if the panelists are okay, we can probably take one more question because I want to be mindful of time and that we are already about 10 minutes over. So,
I have a question, if that's okay, EK. I'm Ramiani. I'm a freshman at Cornell University right now. And I actually had a question for Casey. So I know you talked about the changes you made in your own practices right now in your work. what changes do you think the whole fashion industry could be making to be more inclusive of all kinds of people?
Hi, Ramiani. I think that's a very good, very heavy question. I mean, the thing that you got to realize about most industries is that they are industries, and industries are often playing games with people, and they're trying to work on their bottom line. And I think now, being in my position, I see a lot of companies that are led by individuals who really have beliefs and thoughts and who try to spearhead something new and to try to kind of break the box. And then you see other people that are really just trying to get what they can out of people. And I think, I don't know, I think that in fashion right now, clear voices that have strong opinions are what's really important. Opinions that are empathetic and open-minded and who are pushing it so that we're not just looking at pictures of people wearing clothes anymore. We're looking at identities that have depth, that we know something about their story. We know something about what makes their life beautiful instead of what makes them beautiful. For me, like when I'm designing now, the person that I imagine is this person that is so confident and so strong with themselves that they have excess to give other people and so much empathy to hear other stories and to lift other people up. And I think in general, that's what fashion needs to do, is to kind of look outside of itself and realize that there are new storylines that need to be told. There are new faces that need to be represented. There's a whole different side to beauty that is so much more than the boring old identity of what beauty has been projected on people. And I think the more people do that, the more you have happy people walking around the world knowing that everyone is beautiful. And also the more important part, which is that what's in your brain and what you do for others is actually what makes you beautiful, instead of if you have, a skinny, tall body, which is, often for me now the opposite of beauty. It's I think that's really what I feel is my responsibility now in this place in fashion, is to try to break the box and not make everybody happy, and instead to show them what makes me happy and just deal with the consequences. And I think more people need to think about doing that instead of following suit, because in fashion also a lot of people just follow each other. So instead you gotta say forget it and just do what you think is right.